Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Matt, and today we are brewing an American IPA with Kveik yeast. I'm very excited to get started on this brew day. I got the strike water heating up right now. We're going to try to do a 2-day fermentation, which is pretty fast, but with Kveik yeast, it should be obtainable. We're going to make a few changes in the way we brew the beer and the processes we follow for fermentation, so make sure to stay tuned. Make sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you like grain to glass videos, as there'll be more grain to glass videos coming this year. Anyway, guys, we're going to go ahead and jump right into the beer smithery recipe notes, and then we'll get into the brew day. We first designed this as a 5-gallon recipe and reduced it to a 4.2-gallon recipe. For the malt bill, it's a relatively standard IPA malt bill with standard 2-row for 10 pounds, Munich for head retention and mouthfeel, and caramel 40. For the hops, we're going to be using Centennial 50 ounces at 60 minutes. We're going to be doing a 15-minute edition of Mosaic 1 ounce and 0.5 ounces of Citra. And then we're going to be doing a whirlpool of 1 ounce of Mosaic, 0.5 ounces of Citra, and 0.5 ounces of Centennial for about 15 minutes. We're going to hold around 170 to 180 for my whirlpool. We're also using Lutra Kveik, which should ferment relatively clean. So I figure that would be a good strain of Kveik to use for a American IPA. For the starter information, the Kveik says it has 144 billion yeast cells, and the yeast cells it said it needed is 186 billion. Now the pack I bought says it includes more yeast cells. I don't know what that means. I looked at the pack. I couldn't actually see the cell count on the pack, which I thought was kind of odd. Maybe I missed it. But we're just going to pitch the pack as is, as I heard stressing Kveik out during fermentation is not a big deal. For the water chemistry, we're going to go obviously a very high sulfate to chloride ratio to help promote a drier finish, which will help the hop characteristics perceived to be more bitter. Next, we're going to jump right into the brew day. First, we double crushed our grains to get a fine crush. After milling, we started adjusting our strike water with around 9.08 grams of gypsum, 2.8 grams of Epsom salt, 2 milliliters of lactic acid, 1.6 grams of calcium chloride, 0.8 grams of canning salt, and 0.13 grams of calcium carbonate. After our salts are dissolved, we dough in and stir up the mash to break up any dough balls. We then set our controller to mash at 149. After 15 minutes, we take a pH reading and it comes out too high. Our target is 5.4. Beersmith 3 says to add 6 milliliters, which I thought was too high. We're going to add 4 milliliters and measure from there. After adding the acid, we take a pH reading and it measures out to around 5.4, which is on target. After a 50-minute mash and a 10-minute mash out, we lift the grain bill up and press the grains to get as much wort out as we can. Our pre-boil gravity is around 1055, which is pretty close to target. After we hit our boil, we add 0.5 ounces of Centennial for our bittering addition. With 15 minutes remaining, we add 0.5 ounces of Citra, and we add 1 ounce of Mosaic. We also add around 2.3 grams of yeast nutrient and Wurflock. After our boil, we cool to around 170 and we whirlpool with 1 ounce of Mosaic, 0.5 ounces of Citra, and 0.5 ounces of Centennial. We had to use my dry hopping spider for the whirlpool additions as my hop spider was completely full. After our whirlpool, we cool down to around 95 degrees. Since we'll be only in the fermenter for 2 days, I want to filter out as much trub as I could. We started to move the wort over to the fermenter, and surprisingly there was not as much debris as I thought. Next, we aerate the wort. We do this for a decent amount of time to make sure there's a lot of oxygen in the beer for fermentation. At this point, we pitched our Lutra Kveik at around 90 degrees. We also take an original gravity, which measures out to around 1064, which is on target. Once all of this is packed up for fermentation, we set up the fermentation chamber to hold 90 degrees. All that's in here is a seedling mat. After 2 days, we take a gravity reading to see how fermentation went. There's no activity left in the fermenter and everything settled out, telling me there has not been activity for a decent amount of time. This measured out to around 1010, which is a little higher than was calculated, but since there was no more activity, we called it done here. This is how the fermenter looked. After we purged our keg with CO2, we moved the beer over to the keg using a low oxygen transfer method. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump right into talking about my brew day notes, and then also talk about what I did differently in this beer, and then go into the appearance, aroma, mouthfeel, and flavor notes at the end of the video. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, I've never used Kveik yeast before, but I've always been interested in trying it out. Like I said in the beginning of the video, I've never used Kveik yeast before, and what I've been hearing about the 1 to 2 day fermentation really appealed to me because I'm a very impatient brewer. I like to do fermentation as fast as possible. I usually only leave my beers in the fermenter 1 to 2 weeks, and then it's really off to the keg because I don't like to sit around and wait to try them. I probably will never brew like a barley wine or a ton of lagers, but I like these fast fermentations, so it'll hit the tap as quickly and as fresh as possible. So I had to make a few changes to the brew day to ensure a healthy fermentation, and I really wanted to ensure that it would ferment in 1 to 2 days. So I made some changes in the brew day along with how I treated fermentation to ensure healthy fermentation. So I have a few notes here to talk about. The first change I made was I mashed at a low temp, and this is to ensure that the sugars produced in the mashing step are highly fermentable. If you're unfamiliar, mashing temperature matters as far as what types of sugars are generated during the mashing step. If you mash at a low temp, you're going to be producing highly fermentable sugars that will typically end up a little drier. If you mash at a higher temperature, like the 155 to 158 range, you're going to be producing sugars that are not as fermentable as they would be at a lower temperature, so you're going to end up with a sweeter beer. Because I'm using the Kveik yeast, I wanted to ensure that the sugars were highly fermentable for the yeast. Another thing we did is we of course added yeast nutrient, which is really just a multivitamin. You don't need to add yeast nutrient typically, but for these fast fermentations, I thought adding the yeast nutrient was a good step to ensure healthy fermentation as well. So we did add a little bit of yeast nutrient for that. Also, we always aerate our beers with oxygen. In this case, I really aerated it. So I usually use the like a drill stir stick attachment to whip the beer around in the fermenter. And I usually only do that for about 30 seconds. I believe for this beer, I did it for 2 minutes. I wanted to make sure that there's a ton of oxygen in there to ensure healthy fermentation. It really goes with the yeast nutrient, making sure the yeast have everything they need to ensure a fast and healthy fermentation. Another change we made, probably the biggest change to the recipe we made, was for American IPAs or IPAs in general, dry hopping is a really important step for aroma. But I did not want to dry hop with this really for 2 main reasons. One was the hop debris in the fermenter. I knew if I added hops in the fermenter, it would take more time for it to clear out and all drop out of suspension. Another thing too is I didn't want to have to wait the 3 to 5 days for the dry hopping step. Again, I wanted to ferment this as quick as I could, 1 to 2 days. So I knew I couldn't have a dry hop step. So instead of dry hopping, I opted to whirlpool my hops in the kettle at around 170 to 180. And that will really help with the aroma, still having an impactful aroma and not having to rely on a dry hopping step. Another change we made is we filtered the hops before, or filtered the beer before going into the fermenter, which I never usually do. I usually just take it right from the kettle and put it in the fermenter. A little bit of trub gets in there, it's not a big deal. In this case, I was actually pleasantly surprised. I used a nylon bag to filter, there really wasn't a lot of hop debris. There really wasn't a lot of crap going into the fermenter that was caught in the bag. And the last most obvious change we made is we fermented at 90 degrees for this for 2 days. I gotta say, I was very nervous about the 90-degree thing. I live in Michigan. I ferment in the basement, and it's winter time in Michigan. It's very cold here. And I was like, God, this is like the worst time of year to be trying to hold a high fermentation. But I have a styrofoam box with a seedling heat mat, and it did awesome. I'm really pleasantly surprised on how well it did. I want to say it maybe only dropped the lowest, maybe like 85 degrees the whole time. But the seedling mat helped, keeping it insulated helped, and also just how active the fermentation was. That naturally kept the temperature high in the fermenter. There's 3 other things I want to talk about that's not related to changes I made to promote a healthy fermentation, but really about the brew day in general. So the first thing I want to talk about is my pH. I took a pH and it measured high, which was odd because usually I use Beersmith 3's calculator to calculate what lactic acid I need to add before I mash in, and usually that's very spot on. I'm not sure what happened here. I don't know if there's a calculation on Beersmith 3 and that was wrong, or maybe I entered in some data that was incorrect, but it was way off. Another issue I've been noticing in the last few brew days is my volumes have been off. So if you're familiar with my channel, I usually do 3.5 gallon batches. I actually bumped it up for this year to 4 gallon batches, as I thought 3.5 gallons were just going too fast, honestly. So the 4 gallon mark, I usually target for 4.2 gallons. And ever since I made the change, I'm having big volume issues, so I'm not really sure what's going on. I'm noticing that my pre-boil gravity is on target, and then my original gravity is on target, but I'm missing like a half gallon. So I don't know where it's going. I don't know if it's the boil off or what. In this beer has a good excuse because there's a lot of hops in this beer. So it's very possible that there was just a lot of loss with the hops I added. But other beers that don't have a lot of hops, I'm not really sure what's going on. Another thing I wanted to talk about, and we're gonna get into this during the tasting notes, but the appearance. This ended up finishing really clear. And I'll put a clip on the screen now of what the first pour looked like directly after 48 hours after brew day, but it was pretty cloudy. This cleared up very well. Lastly, we can go into appearance, aroma, mouthfeel, and flavor. So the first thing about appearance I want to mention is, like I said before, it was pretty cloudy. It has cleared up a lot. As far as color goes, I would say it's like an orangish amber color, and the head is a white to off-white head. I'd probably say it leans towards more of like the off-white color, but overall, appearance-wise, I think it looks as it should. Next, we can go into aroma. I would say it's citrus, pine, tropical fruit, and floral, I would say, which is all what I would expect from the hops I used. The floral would come from the Mosaic, the pine would come from the Centennial, the Citra would have the citrus and tropical notes. So those are really my favorite pairings when it comes to IPAs. So if you want to avoid dry hopping in the future, you can always still whirlpool and still get a very nice aroma at the finished product. Next, we can go into mouthfeel. There's not a whole lot to say about mouthfeel other than I would say it's like a medium light body. Lastly is the flavor. So the first thing I should talk about is probably the hop flavor, as that's the most prominent. It's an IPA, as it should be. The hop flavor is really coming through. I would say the most dominant flavors are pine and citrus notes, which are great. It also does have hop bitterness to it, as I would expect as well. The bitterness is not supposed to be super high. I want to say it does taste like it's in the 70 to 80 range. I think calculated it was in the 70 range, but it does lean higher towards the sulfates, so that might also accentuate the hop bitterness as well. To talk about malt flavors, the malt flavors are pretty low on this. I would say the only flavor coming through is caramel, but it's pretty subtle. It's not overpowering at all. You don't get a ton of malt sweetness with this, but you do pick up a little bit of caramel notes. As far as the finish goes, it does finish dry. It did finish final gravity at 1010. which wouldn't make it seem like it's super dry, and it's not super dry. But again, the sulfates do kind of accentuate that dry feeling you get on your palate when you drink beer. I would say it does finish, I would say moderately dry. And as far as aftertaste is concerned, you do get a little bit of lingering with the hop bitterness and the hop flavor, but it's not overpowering and it's not harsh. It's relatively pleasant. But that about covers it. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I had a lot of fun brewing this beer, and make sure to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't done so already. There'll be more Grain to Glass videos coming this year. But anyway, guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.